So our hero today is Moses, known as the lawgiver. First, some opening remarks. We have taken note that the book of Genesis was written not by a single person at one go, as if God dictated to him to write the book of Genesis. Likewise, for the book of Exodus, um, it was not also written by one person at one short period of time. The compilation of the story that we find in the book of Exodus took a long time through various stages of oral and literal traditions. We must also take note that we should not take the details in the book of Exodus literally. They were written in such a way to convey certain messages, not so much the actual details. What is linked to Moses is, of course, this great historical experience for the Israelites, the Exodus. So we must have an idea of the background to this Exodus. It was said that Joseph brought his family members to Egypt when he was the chancellor, and they were all very well treated. And the Israelites who settled in Egypt prospered, and they grew in a great number. Then after some years, the new Pharaoh, said to have known nothing of Joseph, make certain remarks and orders. How that actually could happen, we don't know, because even if just after one or two generations, such great personality in their history, a so-called foreign talent who managed to preserve the country from the disasters of great famine, would have been known for generations to come. So how could this new pharaoh not knew of Joseph? Of course, that was puzzling. But nonetheless, it was said that he then make that comment that these people, the sons of Israel, have become so numerous and strong that they are a threat to us. So we must be prudent and take steps against their increasing any further. So the first strategy was to order the midwives to kill all the male children born of the Hebrew families. But accordingly, the midwives, they fear God and they did not carry out the orders given by the king. So came a second order to throw all the boys born to the Hebrews into the river and only let the girls live. So the background was that the Israelites population grew in such great number that it became a threat to the Egyptians, and they found it necessary to curb the growth by killing the male newborn from the Hebrew families. It was in this context that Moses was born of Hebrew parents. And initially, his parents tried to hit him. And then, when they realized that they could not hide it anymore, uh, Moses was placed in a basket to be floated in the river. And it happened that Pharaoh's daughter was by the river and found the child and loved the child so much that she decided to adopt him. And then came the sister asking her, would you like to have someone to look after, a nanny to look after the child? And the princess said, yes, of course. And then the girl went to look for his mother, who became the nanny for the boy. And then when the child grew up, she brought him to the princess, who treated him like a son. Then years later, when Moses was a grown man, he witnessed an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. And in protecting that Hebrew, he killed the Egyptians. The following day, he tried to mediate between two conflicting Hebrews. And one of them retorted and said, hey, who are you? Who appointed you to be the judge? Don't think that we do not know you killed the Egyptians. And are you going to kill me also? So Moses feared for his life. He thought that if that news spread, of course, he would be arrested for killing the Egyptian. So he escaped to Midian. There he met this family, the priest of Midian, Jethro, and he married his daughter. So that was the background to Moses. Of course, the key part of the whole story is his calling to liberate the Israelites from the Egyptians. Now, there are actually three accounts of the call of Moses. If you recall my talk on the book of Genesis, there are two accounts of God's creation in the book of Genesis. Because that book was compiled eventually by the redactor, and he put together materials from different sources, preserving both. Likewise, the book of Exodus took sources, materials from different sources, and eventually compiled it into this single book. And it happened that there were actually three separate accounts. They were accepted and woven together in the various chapters. Now, we also mentioned that in the book of Genesis as well as the book of Exodus, it has often been expressed in such a way that God spoke to Moses. But then we realize that the way it is being expressed is not that God spoke to me as if Moses speaking in first person, God spoke to me and I hear this, but rather someone else describing Moses. How could that person knew that God spoke to Moses? Say, for example, the experience of the burning bush. Therefore, we are quite certain that that cannot be taken literally. God did not actually appear to Moses and spoke to him face to face. It was described in that manner. We mentioned that the ancient Israelites were very theocentric. Every experience would be expressed in such a way as if God directly intervened in the various aspects of their life. So the first account, sorry, is recorded in Exodus chapter 3. It is said that the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in the shape of the flame of fire coming from the middle of the bush. So we call it the burning bush experience. And we see that at times it uses the word the angel of the Lord appeared. Some other verses said the Lord spoke to Moses directly. So these are just the literary style for the ancient author to express a kind of a God experience, but we cannot take it literally as if God really spoke in Hebrew. Moses had to listen in Hebrew, no, to understand. So we presume that if God really spoke to him, it had to be in Hebrew. But as I said, we cannot take it literally. He had a God experience, yes, but not literally as being expressed. And in that experience, he experienced God as the God of his ancestors. I'm the God of your father. I've seen the miserable state of my people in Egypt. The cry of the sons of Israel has come to me, and I have witnessed the way in which the Egyptians oppressed them. I send you to Pharaoh to bring the sons of Israel, my people, out of Egypt. In this passage, we have the expressions that God cared for his people, the Israelites. God have heard their cry to him in their misery. We mentioned they were exploited to do hard labor. And then now the call, sending Moses to speak to Pharaoh to allow the people to leave Egypt. In that experience, God revealed his identity to Moses. I shall be with you, and this is a sign by which you shall know that it is I who have sent you. The key expressions is chapter 3, verse 14, when God said, I am who I am. I am has sent me to you. You are to say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name for all time. By this name I shall be invoked for all generations to come. This expression, I am who I am, is very unique. An expression that tells us that God is actually beyond any description. He is simply a pure being. He's simply I am. No description is adequate to express who God is. And the most intimate expression for the Israelites would be that personal relationship with God. He is the God of their people. He is the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And we hear that expressions many times in the Old Testament writings. With that experience of God at the burning bush, Moses received the call to liberate his people from the yoke of the Egyptian. But Moses did not say yes immediately. He gave a number of excuses why he should not be the one to speak to Pharaoh. First, he expressed his hesitant by these words. They will not believe me. My people, if I tell them that, oh, God has called me to bring you out of Egypt, they will not believe me. And if I speak to Pharaoh that I coming to make this request, Pharaoh will not believe me also. So it's at the same time an expression of his own inadequacy, but at the same time also his fear. But then the reply from God is that, don't worry, I shall be with you, I will help you. So this is no excuse for you to say no to my call. Moses' second excuse was to say, no, but you asked me to go and speak to my people, you asked me to go speak to Pharaoh, but I cannot speak well, no, I'm not a man of eloquence in my speech. And then the reply came, who make man, who gave man his mouth? God. So if I chose you, I will put words into your mouth. Besides, okay, fair enough, you say that you can't speak well, but I'm sending your brother Aaron with you. He is a better speaker and he will speak to the people. So in that way, God answered Moses' fear and reluctancy and assured him of help, divine help as a human help from his brother. In Exodus 4 and 6, there is mentioning of the second account of his calling. First, there is a second description about Moses who went to Midian, and then from there he felt called to return to Egypt. So initially, actually, he was outside of Egypt after the incident. And here in chapter 6, I am the Lord, I will free you from the burdens which the Egyptians lay on you. I will release you from slavery to them, and with my arm upstretched and my strokes of power, I will deliver you. I will adopt you as my own people, and I will be your God. In the book of Exodus, we see that expression quite often, where God assured the people that I'm your God, you are my people. That very personal and intimate relationship they felt with the Lord. Further down, we have a third account of the call of Moses. Repeated again that the Lord spoke to Moses, I make you as a God of Pharaoh, for Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother is to be your prophet. You yourself must tell him all I command you, and Aaron your brother will ask Pharaoh to let the sons of Israel leave his land. I will make Pharaoh's heart stubborn and perform many a sign and wonder in the land of Egypt. So the third account of the calling of Moses and asking him to set the people free. Now we mentioned that for ancient Israelites, no matter what happened, they always attributed those incidents to God. Even the refusal of Pharaoh to let the Israelites go would be expressed in such a way that it was God who hardened the heart of Pharaoh. For us, of course, we would not use that expressions, but for a theocentric mentality, they would be able to express in that way. But realistically, how could that be? God wanted to liberate them. That the best way to soften the heart of Pharaoh. Why would the Lord wanted to harden his heart? Anyway, that was their expression. So Moses went to speak to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said, no way. And eventually it was said that 10 plagues were laid upon the Egyptian as punishment to impress upon Pharaoh and the Egyptians that God was behind this ideal of liberating them from Egypt. So if you read the text from chapter 7 to 11, you have the first plague, the waters were turned to blood, and many Egyptians could not drink the water because it was foul. The second plague, flocks swarmed forth, covering every inch of the land, entering houses and bedrooms. The third one, lice came all over Egypt, bugs crawled forth from the dust to cover the land. Number four, wild animals destroyed everything in their path. Pestilence, a fatal pestilence killed most of the domestic animals of the Egyptians. Boils, these painful boils on the bodies that cause great pain. Fiery hail that struck down all the crops in the fields, shattered every tree, and then locusts covered the face of the earth and swallowed up every crops and all the fruits of the tree. And number nine, a thick darkness covered the land of Egypt. And then eventually the 10th plague. Scholars would debate on the historicity of this 10th plague, whether actually that plague happened or whether they actually put together these natural disasters actually over long period of time, but kind of crystallize them together one shot in this period of time before the Israelite left Egypt. We would know that all these kinds of natural disasters, whether frogs or whether locusts and all that, it happened all the time, part of the natural disasters. But to put them together and express in such a way that it was God's punishment on the Egyptians, debatable. Most probably not literally true. And then it was said that the last straw that really breaks the will of Pharaoh and eventually led to he giving permission for the Israelite to leave was that at midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, the firstborn of Pharaoh, heir of his throne, the firstborn of the prisoners, even the prisoners, and even the firstborn of all cattle. A bit of exaggerations. So with all these so-called punishments melted out to the Egyptians, eventually Pharaoh said, okay, you may go. And in Exodus chapter 12 and 13, it is described that the Israelites eventually departed Egypt. And before they leave, Moses even took the bones of Moses with him. And then as they traveled, they were led by day by pillar of clouds, and at night a pillar of fire. Now, look in verse 12:39. It was said that they had been driven out of Egypt with no time for dallying. Now, it was the Egyptian who kind of forced them out, not so much the Israelite wanted to live. That seems to be a contradiction because the whole story was put in such a way that the Egyptian refused them living, but Moses had to fought for it and they had to be punished by the 10 plagues. Then only Pharaoh released them. But here, interestingly, verse 39 of chapter 12, that it was said that it was the Egyptian who drove them out. We don't want you here. You better get out. Well, that is an interesting remark. So we may ask the question: were the 10 plague and the parting of the Red Sea historical or allegorical? We do not know for sure. Probably not literally so. The way God behaved and God so-called punished the Egyptians and only favor the Israelites, although they suffered under the Egyptians, hard labor and so forth. But for God to kill every firstborn of the Egyptians. That doesn't tally with our understanding of who God is. So I mentioned in the talk the angry God, that the ancient Israelites, they thought that God was like that, and attributed their human behavior to God, and also attributed natural events to God. So probably it was not literally as described. Yes, something happened and so forth, and the Israelites, they were initially in Egypt, but then eventually they left. Yes, but the whole background to it, the details of it is debatable. Partly also because in other historical sources, whether in the writings of the Egyptian historians or the historians of the neighboring countries, you could not find compatible materials about that whole event. Something happened, yes, but not exactly as what described in the book of Exodus. However, the significance for Israel in this whole story about the Exodus is summed up in the victory song of Exodus chapter 15, verse 1 to 18. Basically, it was a song in praise of God, God who came to the rescue of the Israelites and helped them out of their misery and liberated them from slavery in Egypt, and eventually leading and guiding them to the promised land. So it is a testimony of faith by a believing community. But as I said, the details of that whole experience may be debatable, although something did happen. There is, of course, an important concept in this whole experience of the Exodus, known as the Passover. Before they departed, they took their meal in haste, and they were to put their loins girded, shoes on their feet, staff in their hands, and the food eaten in haste. No time to have a leisure meal. They must get ready to go, to escape. And then, of course, that incident about marking the doorpost with the blood of the lamb, and the angel of the Lord, when they saw the blood of the lamb, were to pass over, and therefore the lives of the Israelites were spared. Only the sons of Egyptians were struck down by the angel of death. Again, historically, God would melt out such a punishment on the Egyptians without so, because our understanding of God, as revealed by Jesus Christ, is not such a God. So God would not have done such thing. Now, not only about the calling of Moses was actually a compilation from different sources. We realize that the description about the Passover feast, there were a few passages repeated over and over again. And also about the feast of the unleavened bread. And then this incident about the firstborn, also there are three different accounts. In chapter 11, chapter 13, there are two parts of it. And then with regard to the departure that God asked Moses to lead the people out, again, there's a short description in chapter 12. And then
so when they left Egypt, and then they started to wander in the wilderness for a long period, we call that the desert experience. And two striking things that we read from the book of Exodus is the complaint of the Israelites. First, they complained of no food. In chapter 16, the whole community of the sons of Israel began to complain against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness and said to them, why did you not die at the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt when we were able to sit down to pans of meat and could eat bread to our heart's content? As it is, you have brought us to this wilderness to starve this whole company to death. So they were complaining, at least in Egypt, we have food to eat, even meat, but then in the desert, what food do we have? Then eventually, okay, God provided them manna. Historians were trying to find out what actually is this manna they found in the desert. So it was, of course, we have no exact answer to it. Anyway, they had bare minimum of food in the desert. Desert, of course, is a very harsh place. But they endured somehow with the provision of manna. But of course, more importantly, eventually in the New Testament gospel reference, Jesus came among us and he came as the bread of life. And the second complaint is about water, no drink. Exodus 17, they grumble against Moses. Give us water to drink. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Was it not that we should die of thirst, our children also, and cattle? And then God commanded Moses to strike his staff on the rock and water flew out. Eventually, reference to Jesus, Jesus came to us as the living water. So it was not easy life for them in the desert, very harsh conditions, and not everyone could take it. And inevitably, there would be complaints, grumbling, disillusionments among them. Then came this very drastic happening. They were complaining and so forth, and then they experienced snake bites. And then Moses erected a bronze serpent, put it up on the pole, and they were asked to look at the bronze serpent and be cured. You know that historically the occurrence of serpents in the desert and people dying of a snake's bite would not be unusual. But the Israelites, they always need a theological explanations to every experience. So in this case, they interpreted the snake bite as God's punishment for their complaints. And so if they acknowledge their sin, they could then be healed of the snake bite. Moses made a bronze serpent and had it lifted up on the pole and instructed them to look at it. The key is that they must be remorseful, they must repent, and then they were cured. Years later, that bronze serpent was preserved, and years later, the Israelites, they forgot about the initial context of the bronze serpent, and they actually worshipped the bronze serpent as a deity. And that was obviously wrong. It was God who healed them, not the bronze serpent. The bronze serpent was just a means for them to be reminded of the source of their problem. Anyway, then a just king eventually came along, King Hezekiah, who ordered the destruction of the bronze serpent. Then they came to Mount Sinai, and then we have the whole descriptions about Moses going up to Mount Sinai, and there he had another experience of God, and God gave him the laws, and emphasis was on the so-called Decalogues, the 10 words, the 10 commandments written on 2 stone tablets. Initially, he went the first time and something happened. The people, we mentioned about that later. And then he went up the second time and brought back the tablet again. Some scholars say that actually here again there are two accounts. And so two accounts of Moses going up to the mountain, and so separately being narrated. So on this part, I will not describe further. Please refer to my talk on the relevancies of Old Testament laws to Christian today. Basically, in that talk, I was saying that it was actually Moses, not only Moses, but their leaders who promulgated the laws and attributed that to God. And why we say that the laws could not be from God, and I have explained to you in terms of the context, in terms of the content, and so forth. These laws could not be from God. Because, for example, God could not order the stoning to death of the people. God could not mandated certain food cleanliness laws and so forth, which Jesus eventually, if you read the Bible, Jesus mentioned that these laws about the uncleanliness of pots and pans and food and so forth was not relevant to living out the faith and morality for the disciples. And of course, the way Jesus treated the women who was brought before him who had committed adultery by saying that who has no sin be the first to cast a stone, and thus not carry out the law which prescribed that the adulterous woman must be stoned to death. So these facts would testify to the fact that the Ten Commandments, as well as these other laws and many detailed laws in the Old Testament, could not be literally from God, but ancient Israelite attributed to God. If you want to know more, please refer to my talk on the relevancy of the Old Testament laws to Christians today. Now, it was said that when Moses was out there to speak to God, down at the foot of the mountain, the people rebelled. They gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." And Aaron, is Aaron, the brother of Moses, who's supposed to be on the side of Moses, told them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters were wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." Obviously, a very serious offense, amounting to idol worship of the surrounding tribes and people. And it was, in a way, a bit puzzling that actually Aaron himself was involved in this making of the golden calf. And strange enough, Aaron was not punished. This would be punishable by death in terms of seriousness. Somehow he was not, and he was pardoned. And not only that, eventually he was made the high priest. Interesting remark here to make. But it shows that the people actually in the desert experience include not only the grumbling and the complaint that they had not enough food and not enough drink, but also they were constantly being tempted to follow the so-called pagan practices of the surrounding tribes. And that was actually a constant challenge for them. This episode of the golden calf was just a kind of a way to express that experience, but it must be not just a single experience. It must be a constant test for them that they wanted to follow the practices of their neighboring tribes. So with regard to Moses, that's what I have to share with you. Now I would like to make a reference to the Gospel of Matthew. It's interesting that the Gospel of Matthew presented Jesus as the new Moses. And the reason because the Gospel of Matthew was written initially for the Jewish Christians. And he wanted to impress upon the readers that Jesus had come to replace Moses and to set new standard for the disciples. So there was that comparison about the childhood experience of Jesus, going to Egypt and so forth, but in a reverse sequence. And then at the beginning of the public ministry of Jesus, it was said that Jesus went up to the mountain to preach. And it was there in chapter 5 to 7, we have the Sermon of the Mount. Of course, Moses was said to have gone up to Mount Sinai, received the law. But now this new Moses, Jesus, he has come. And his teaching is an invitation to his disciples to transcend the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. And we know that the scribes and the Pharisees, they were strict adherents to the Mosaic laws. And so Jesus has come to kind of replace Moses. And the Gospel of Matthew is structured in such a way that it consists of 5 parts, 5 books. And besides the infancy narrative and then the passion narrative and the resurrection, the central part of the Gospel of Matthew can be divided into 5 parts, thus echoing the 5 books of the Pentateuch. And now Jesus, with his teaching, is to kind of take over the role of Moses. Now, as Christians, as disciples of Christ, they are to follow the teaching of Jesus, not the Mosaic law. Jesus declared that he had come to fulfill the law and the prophets. He instructed the disciples that their righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. In the rest of chapter 5, expand these demands by taking some Old Testament teaching and expounding them in a manner beyond what the scribes and the Pharisees would expect of the people. So here we see clearly the Gospel of Matthew present Jesus as having the authority far beyond Moses, and his disciples were to follow him and in their way of living up the gospel to transcend that of the teaching of the scribes and Pharisees. Now, the 4 Gospels also present Jesus as the new Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Jesus had his Last Supper on Holy Thursday, on the Thursday, celebration of Passover meal. Then on Good Friday, he was condemned by Pilate and crucified, eventually died at 3 p.m. And during that time, it was at that time that in the temple, the lambs were being slaughtered, preparing for the official Passover meal that took place that evening after sunset. By writing the Last Supper and the death of Jesus in that manner, the Gospel writers were clearly trying to present to Christian readers that Jesus is the Lamb of God. He is the one who sacrificed himself for the salvation of the world. In the Exodus experience, it was that lamb, the blood that was painted on the doorpost, which saved the Israelites from the angels of death. But in the New Testament, Jesus is clearly presented as the one who is saving his people from their sins. In the Passover of the Old Covenant, that 1 year unblemished male lamb was sacrificed, roasted and eaten with unleavened bread. In the New Testament, Jesus, sinless, is the new Passover lamb. And by his blood, the new and everlasting covenant is made. And by his sacrifice, a new exodus takes place. The believers are liberated from the yoke of sin, to the slavery of sin, and gain new life in Jesus. So we hear today these expressions of Passover very frequently, but if we understand the background to it, then we see the significance of how it is being described in the Gospels. Some reflections, 4 points for you. First, regarding vocation. In the story of the Exodus, Moses was called by the Lord with a special mission, and he gave some excuses not being able to fulfill, but God convinced him, and then he carried out his call. Likewise, each and every one of us also has a special call. We have a vocation to fulfill God's mission for us. So we have to reflect, how do we live out this calling? Do we give excuses not living up? Or do we surrender ourselves to God and allow him to lead and guide us? Second reflection with regard to social justice. Moses led his people out of Egypt from slavery to freedom. And we know that in different societies, there have always been minority groups, sometimes migrant workers, sometimes people who are marginalized, the handicapped, etc. They are the voiceless people, and in different societies they can be overlooked, they can be even put in very harsh conditions. For example, the mining workers in many countries, very dangerous conditions, no security for them and so forth. They were exploited in that sense. And as Christians, what is our role in promoting social justice and voicing out for the rights of these marginalized people? The third reflection questions the desert experience. Today, we use the word desert experience to describe a period of hardships and struggles that we may experience in life. And when we have those desert experience, how do we respond? Do we just blame and complain and just being very negative about that whole experience? Or do we, with the grace of God, face our hardships courageously and try to tackle and overcome them with the grace of God? And last but not least, the fourth question is to reflect on the meaning of the law. Do we understand and uphold the spirit of the laws? In every institution, in every society, there will be rules and regulations. They are needed because human beings, we are weak, and so we tend to be ill-disciplined, and the laws are meant to lead and guide us. But at times we can be forgetting the purpose of the law and become so legalistic. But with regard to Christian living, ultimately we must follow Christ. Christ is the one who helped us to transcend the preoccupation with the laws. And for us, it is to live up the Christian values, that is to follow the gospel teaching of Christ, which transcends the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. So thank you for listening.